Here's the truth. As long as you're translating in your head, you'll never sound fluent. But you can train your brain to think in Spanish, exactly how natives do. Soy Hamid, tengo 16 años y hablo 4 idiomas con fluidez. Me hice fluido en español en solo 120 horas de estudio. Y ahora ayudo a la gente a hablar español con fluidez más rápido.
Podré para mejorar mi español cuando no tengo mucho tiempo libre para estudiar español.
In this video, I'll show you the exact steps you need to take to make that mental switch happen. And basically, no one talks about this online. The only word you need to know is logic. Okay? The reason why you're not able to think in Spanish, the reason why you're thinking in English and then trying to speak in Spanish is because of logic, okay? If you try to imagine what the word think means, like, what does it mean to think? Well, we know that has something to do with our brains. And one of the definitions of thinking is to actively use your mind to come to a conclusion. And in the Spanish learning context, it is using your mind to create a sentence. And so when you're thinking in English, you're using English logic to create Spanish sentences. And that is the issue, okay? If you've ever thought about, like, why is it that some people can speak so fast and fluently and like as though they've memorized it? The fact is that they haven't actually memorized it. I haven't memorized the sentence I just said. I don't have like a script in front of me. No, it's just that I have the logic to create that sentence. And so I think, aka I actively use logic in my mind to create that sentence. And then I say it. The same thing applies in Spanish, where if you're thinking in English logic, you're thinking in English and then you're saying something in Spanish, the logic is not there. And when the logic isn't there, you will fundamentally make mistakes, okay? If you don't know, I was born and raised in Sweden, and I've gone to many international schools where there are people who weren't really born here, and a lot of them speak English and then they speak Swedish as a second language. A mistake that a lot of people make is trying to say, for example, where, for example, the word for in Swedish you'd think would be för, which in some situations it is. And then the word for example is exempel. And so a lot of international students would make this mistake of för exempel to say for example, when in reality in Swedish we say till exempel. And so there you can see how using English logic in another language will almost always hurt your fluency. And obviously the example I just gave is like a minute example, right? But with Spanish, this matters a lot because in Spanish, there's no such thing as to stay. There's no such verb. It doesn't exist. Instead, in Spanish, there is to remain oneself, okay? And so in Spanish, there's a reason why you say me quedo. There's no such verb as to stay. In fact, a lot of people make this mistake of acting like there's the verb to like in Spanish. There's no such thing. Like, there's no such verb as to like in Spanish. I know everyone tells you it's gustar. Gustar doesn't mean to like. Isn't that crazy? There's no such verb as to like in Spanish. And so if you're using the English logic of to like, okay, that will never be able to translate into Spanish. Because in Spanish, you don't have the verb to like, you have the verb to be pleasing, which is gustar. And that's why in Spanish you say, it is pleasing to me, in order to say that you like it. Because if it is pleasing to you, then you like it. And so you can imagine it as expressions in math, where you can either think that 2 is 1 plus 1, or you can think that 2 is 4 divided by 2. They're both the same thing. That's why the equal sign is there. But it's just a different logic, okay? And so just like in maths, which is just another language, sort of, another logic, or in programming languages where they express different things in different ways, those ways are the logic of the language. And so if you're operating on this logic, when you're supposed to be operating on this logic, but you're going to make tons of mistakes. And this is especially true for languages like Spanish, where the whole system is completely different in terms of verbs, okay? And by the way, if you're just getting started, I highly recommend checking out the Speedy Spanish Roadmap, which is a free course I made to help you start learning Spanish with these frameworks, and it'll be the first link in the description. And so when translating between English and Spanish, what we're translating is logic, not words. And this is why in my program, when I teach, for example, transcript training, which is how I teach vocabulary, I specifically tell them that when they use translators, that they should use a specific method for using translators, where they should try to decipher the logic. And I'll probably make a video in the future on exactly how to use translators in order to decipher the logic instead of just a word-for-word translation. That being said, okay, you might be wondering, okay, what is the fix? Okay, how do I learn the Spanish logic? And this is where I talk about what I like to call the 3 W's, okay? And so logic in language sounds kind of like a complicated word. So what it actually is just grammar. And so you can think of this as like the grammar framework, okay? You see, most people do find grammar extremely hard, and it's because they don't do this right here, okay? And this is probably what you've been doing. If you're struggling with thinking in Spanish and you're struggling with translating from English to Spanish, you probably are mainly struggling with grammar as well. And this is the reason why. In any Spanish sentence, there are two parts. There are what the words are and then where they're placed, okay? So for example, we have te ayudo, which means I'm helping you or I help you, okay? In this case, we have the what, which is the words te and ayudo, and then where they're placed. So we know it's not ayudo te, it's te ayudo. We know the order in which they're placed. The problem is that most people memorize the what and the where, and that makes it not make sense. And this is like the nucleus of the issue. This is the most important part of this, okay? The reason why you're struggling with grammar is because you're not understanding the why. Because we mentioned two W's, the what and the where. The why, the third W, is what most people miss. And this is where we talk about logic, okay? And this matters because when we understand why certain things happen in language, then it makes more sense. And when it makes more sense, you remember it better. And you're able to recall on the words faster. That's why when you're speaking English, you're just able to yap, right? But not in Spanish. Because in Spanish, you're thinking on a different logic. You haven't gotten the why, and so you're left with memorizing the what and the where. And that is a very tough position to be in. What's happening is you don't understand the logic of why 4 divided by 2 equals 2. And that is why you're struggling with this logic right here, okay? It's not because you're stupid, because you already speak English. Like, you are fluent in English, which means you have a level of understanding of the logic, okay? These are both the same thing. They're just different ways, different expressions of the same thing. And so the reason why you're struggling with Spanish, or in this analogy, 4 divided by 2, this logic doesn't make sense to you, but this one does. Meaning the English logic makes sense, but the Spanish logic doesn't. And the problem is, if you try to memorize that 1 plus 1 equals 4 divided by 2, if you guess something like 3 plus 3 equals 18 divided by 3, you will be lost. And that is the issue of not learning the why, okay? If you try memorizing this example, you're not going to be able to do it the next time. And that's why you have to understand the why. You have to understand why this is true. Why 3 plus 3, which you know is 6, is the same as 18 divided by 3. And so this is why I'm so against memorization, because memorization is essentially taking every single example where, for example, a division is used and memorizing every single one of them instead of understanding the logic, instead of understanding what does this even mean? What does this sign mean, right? And in Spanish, this is understanding what does gustar even mean? Why does me gusta mean I like instead of yo gusto? Why is it how did we get there? What is the logic? Okay? And so the why is the root of the problem here. Natives operate on a different logic. That's why they're able to blurt out sentences. And so if you don't learn that same logic, you're going to be stuck with the what and the where. And that is such a tough position to be in because you're in a position of guessing, basically. Just hoping that the sentence that you memorized is actually applicable in this situation. Instead of understanding how the sentence is made and the logic behind the sentence, in which case you'll be able to use the logic in every single other sentence in the language, which is so much more advantageous. And so memorizing gives you pieces, but understanding gives you the system. And so once you see a rule, then you can apply it in 1,000 different ways. And so that is your issue right there. You haven't been understanding the Spanish logic, okay? And so the practical tip here is ask the question why and actually try to answer the question. Actually try to understand why things happen in Spanish, why that sentence is like that, okay? You want to push it to its absolute furthest degree, okay? Even to historical reasons, okay? Because humans are just logical and we prefer reasoning over non-reasoning. Literally just using the word because automatically makes people more likely to comply because it offers a rational explanation, and humans will always opt for rationality because we're smart. And so instead of memorizing this equation right here, try understanding this equation and practice the equation many times. I'm not saying don't repeat, but we still want to do repetition. But it's how we repeat and what we repeat. If we're repeating equations and memorizing different examples, we're not learning, we're memorizing. Whereas if we're trying to understand this expression in this equation through many different examples and try to understand the why, then we'll be able to solve every single equation with this logic. I hope you enjoyed and stay humble.